He's not a household name in the West, and that's what galls Kremlin critics. We're talking about Crimean-born filmmaker Oleg Sentsov. The 42-year-old is now on day 100 of a hunger strike in an Arctic penal colony, and close to death, claim his advocates. We'll be telling the story of this outspoken critic of Russia's annexation of Crimea, who's one of dozens of Ukrainians languishing in Russian jails, awaiting an eventual prisoner swap, perhaps, as that low-level conflict between Kiev and Moscow proxies endures in the Russian-speaking east of Ukraine. Russia's president, who's seen here dancing at last weekend's wedding of Austria's far-right foreign minister, showed no mercy when he was asked about Sentsov back in June. What's at stake for Vladimir Putin? What response from the rest of Europe? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at 100 days of hunger strike for Oleg Sentsov. And joining us, Arna Garmash. She chairs the advocacy group Ukraine Action. Thank you for being with us.
Hello.
And we want to welcome from London South African crime novelist Margie Orford, who's a board member of the prestigious PEN International Writers Association. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Everyone from Canada's foreign minister to French New Wave film director Jean-Luc Godard expressing their support for Oleg Sentsov this Tuesday. We saw his story, and I'll talk about it with you, Anna Garmish. The story of Sentsov, he's arrested in 2014.
Exactly, on the 10th of May.
And he his charges are switched around to that of terror charges.
Actually, there were, I think, terror charges pretty much initially. He was charged with leading a terrorist group, pretty much, of 4 people that were supposed to, allegedly, of course, I think blow up a Lenin statue and also a memorial for the Second World War. And this is pretty much it. And supposedly they also were planning on setting fire on a building of United Russia, the party, basically the local office of the party in Crimea.
And as we were saying, advocates saying that these are trumped-up charges. Luke Shrego filing this report.
Save Oleg Sentsov. That was the message from several dozen protesters outside the Russian embassy in Kiev. Held in a Russian prison on terror charges, the Ukrainian filmmaker on Tuesday entered the 100th day of a hunger strike.
We don't know how much longer he can stay on hunger strike. We're always worried about his critical condition. He's been resuscitated already. His condition is bad, let's be honest. And for this moment, we have no proper information about the condition of his health.
That was an allegation quickly denied by Russian officials, who said doctors examined Sentsov on Monday, calling his condition satisfactory. Sentsov was in good health during his trial in 2015 and seemed confident when talking about his situation.
I've been in your country for a year. I watch your wonderful television. Your news bulletins are very good. Your propaganda is working very well.
A former e-sport champion, Sentsov released his first film, Gamer, in 2011. 2 years later, he joined the Euromaidan movement, which rejected Moscow's annexation of Crimea. Sentsov was arrested by Russian security forces in 2014 and sentenced to 20 years of hard labor for terrorism and arms trafficking. On May 14, 2018, he began his hunger strike.
I understand that Oleg does not intend to stop until Ukrainian political prisoners are released. He has the strength of mind to endure the conditions in prison and the hope that his demands will eventually be met.
Last week, French President Emmanuel Macron asked counterpart Vladimir Putin to consider a humanitarian solution to the situation. The Kremlin, though, says Sentsov cannot be released because he's refused to ask for a pardon.
Now, Margie Orford, there was a rally earlier in London for Oleg Sentsov. Tell us about that.
Yes, it was organised with PEN International's free speech organisation, Amnesty English PEN. We held it out there because one of the
problems. I'm sure we'll look at it in a minute with Oleg Sentsov's trial and then his imprisonment. He's on hunger strike, but another thing that he's been suffocated of information. He can't get letters, he can't correspond with people who care for him, his family. So writers, filmmakers, from people like Wim Wenders, Kim Loach, Margaret Atwood, and a number of others have put letters together to send to him so that he knows that he's not alone, that he might be in Siberia in a penal colony, but the writers and creative people all around the world stand with him in this time that we can all imagine ourselves in it, you know, that freedom of speech being taken away, freedom of creativity. So the Russian embassy, what we wanted to do was deliver it to the Russian embassy, but they refused to allow that. So we read a short story of his outside and messages from writers and filmmakers from all around the world, and it was very moving. It was, I hope we were heard. And then we delivered the letters.
What's your view is when you think back, Vladimir Putin was on the eve of the World Cup, where he said he's not being imprisoned because of his opinions. He's being imprisoned for acts of terror, is what he said effectively in a television interview. What's your view on why on what the stakes are for Vladimir Putin with the case of Oleg Sentsov?
I think, you know, this trial happened, or he was arrested because of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. I mean, that is, you know, accepted by all international bodies that that annexation and the invasion was illegal. Oleg Sentsov was then taken and held without trial in Russia for a year. He was then tried as a civilian in a military court. So there are all sorts of breaches of international law. The main prosecution witness withdrew his testimony. He said that had been extracted under torture. And Oleg Sentsov also claimed with much credibility that he had been tortured and threatened. So the trial itself seems like a show trial. You know, it's all in breach of international law, plus withholding letters, withholding treatment, putting him so far away outside of his country. Those are all breaches. Those all amount, some of them, to torture. I think for Putin, I mean, Putin seems to play some sort of game of macho, you know, anything that kind of challenges him. His ego seems so fragile, he then has to kind of fight and defend this place. So, but for him to let Sentsov out would, I suppose, be an admission that that annexation of Crimea is illegal, and that Sentsov, as a filmmaker and as a protester, was quite legitimately doing what you should do as a person living under a democratic government.
Anna Garmisch, is it a question for the Russian president of posture? This is the stance he's got to take, or is it a bargaining chip? After all, there are Russian prisoners in Ukraine, and there's been talk of prisoner swaps.
I think personally that it's a question of posture mainly, because there are indeed many Russian prisoners in Ukraine, but there are 69 today. As of today, there are 69 Ukrainian political prisoners in Russia. So there are many other prisoners that he could have swapped. In the case of Oleg Sentsov in particular, in my opinion, it is a question of posture, very much so, because what we know of Oleg Sentsov's character and why he's doing what he's doing exactly, he's not doing this for his own release or basically to save himself. He's doing this, he claimed this, to free all those 69 prisoners, actually even 68, because he doesn't really care about himself very much. He mentioned previously, way before starting this hunger strike, that he wanted to be a nail in the coffin of a tyrant, and that this, basically he said, stay assured, this nail will not bend. So he's very much aware of his position as a pretty well-known political prisoner, because, you know, as a filmmaker, he's been defended by quite famous people in the West and pretty much everywhere in the world. And he wants to use this position enforce his ideas, what he was doing before he was imprisoned.
What do you think of the attitude of Ukrainian authorities? Because there's been most notably the arrest of the editor-in-chief of RIA Novosti in Kiev. Kirill Vishnitsky is his name. Is that just, I mean, is that unfairly tit-for-tat kind of stuff?
RIA Novosti has been, I'm not, to be honest, I'm not fully aware of all of the details of this arrest, so I'm not very comfortable talking to you exactly if this is really a retribution kind of thing. However, there's been a lot of effort done so far to free Oleg Sentsov and other political prisoners, and it hasn't brought a lot of fruit, as you probably know, because so far out of 69, well, now 69, but 3 have been pardoned and another couple have been released for 1 or 2 reasons, but only a few have been released so far.
Mark Yorford, your thoughts on how to handle this, how to have the West should handle it. We saw in that report earlier, the French president has brought up the topics at several occasions with Vladimir Putin. We've had messages of support this Tuesday, again, from the UK Foreign Office, from Canada's foreign minister. What's the effective way to get a result here?
I think that the way to a result, first of all, it's not a quick path or an easy path if you're dealing with a despot, and especially somebody who's very afraid of creativity or free expression like you have with Putin. So we have to keep on working and keep on with these sorts of campaigns. I'm a South African. I grew up, under apartheid, which was an incredibly long time in which people protested and struggled against that. I do believe it pays off in the end. The great problem with Oleg Sentsov is reports are that he's really, really ill. He was in intensive care. A human rights defender in Russia has seen him. He's extremely sick. So there is a very, very strong possibility that he will die. I think that what we need to do, people in the West, I think what Macron is doing, what the EU, what other people are doing to pressurize Putin and Russia are the only things that we can do. But those need to be increased. Further pressure needs to be put on them. I know in 2015, when the annexation first happened, there was strong responses from the US as well. So I would call on the United States to join with that. Oleg Sentsov, we must remember, is a son. He's a father. He's got 2 young children, a boy of 14, a girl of 16. It's a political case, but it's also a human being who's in this place. So I think that ordinary citizens can do this as well, this kind of protest that we saw in London, in the Ukraine, right across the world today in solidarity with him, because he's a well-known man. His films are known, but he stands in, which is what artists and writers do, he stands in and speaks for all the people who don't have a public voice. So people's support for him is more than just for Oleg Sentsov. It's for the people that he speaks for as well. So I would say continue with these peaceful protests. When the media, like you're doing, draw attention to cases like this, it's very, very valuable, to give accurate and in-depth kind of news and reporting on this. And it's the only thing we can do, because without free expression, there is no democracy. So it's in our own interests to defend him as well.
Do you get the sense that free expression is having less impact than before, what with, I guess, what we've been calling competing narratives more and more?
I think there are 2 things going on. I think that freedom of expression is increasingly under threat because authoritarian governments are very threatened by diversity of views and various things. What we've seen in the Ukraine and in a number of places is a kind of release of information or false information that kind of obscures and confuses the issue. I mean, one of the things, there are always competing narratives around these sorts of issues, but there are many, many breaches of international law, which is not about competing narratives. That is about the law was broken here, these cases are breaches in human rights cases. So I think that in this particular case, we can be very sure of the fact that there have been a number of breaches of law. That is the truth. How we then take those and deal with them is a way of swaying opinion around to supporting this sorts of thing, because it is Ukraine and Russia at the moment which have great threats of free expression. In Western Europe in the 1930s, it was Germany, France, a number of places where the Nazis were on the rise. So it is an area that we need to defend very carefully, and to ensure that we get our governments to do the same, to make sure that people like Oleg Sentsov are free. And what we need to remember as well is a hunger strike. People undertake a hunger strike when your last weapon is your own body, when you're willing to sacrifice yourself. And it's an indication of an absolutely desperate situation and of an extreme brutality of the regime that he's dealing with, and with Putin, that he has to go to these measures.
Very briefly, Anna Garmisch, we're talking about Oleg Sentsov.
Yes.
We haven't been talking that much of late about Eastern Ukraine. And this, of course, draws attention to it, which is probably one of the reasons why he's such an important bargaining chip.
Yes, the war in eastern Ukraine does continue still. We don't talk about this because it seems to me that there is nothing, so to speak, new happening, but people are dying on a daily basis. So far, there have been, I think, over 10,000 people who died as a result of this war. And also there are millions of displaced people. So yes, the consequences of this war still last, and the war is still ongoing. He might be, again, a bargaining chip, but I think it goes way beyond that. It goes because war in eastern Ukraine is one thing, but there's also the case of Crimea that has been, as it has been previously mentioned, illegally annexed. And currently in Crimea, a lot of processes are going on. For instance, the population is changing, evolving right now, because those people who were living in Crimea as it was annexed are not exactly the same ones who live there now, because there have been so many cases of torture, of political prisoners, of kidnappings, of extortion, of every kind of pressure you can imagine, political pressure, on the population. Crimean Tatars are leaving, Ukrainians are leaving, and they're being replaced by...
and that's upping the stakes as well. Anna Garmisch, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank as well Margie Orford for joining us from London. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.